The hospital was always busy, but today felt different. Nurses rushed through the halls, doctors spoke in hushed tones, and the usual hum of activity had an edge of tension. In the middle of it all stood a nurse, someone who had spent years caring for others without hesitation. This nurse had seen it all: long nights, difficult patients, heartbreaking losses, but nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. In one of the rooms lay an elderly veteran, a man who had served his country years ago. His body was frail, his voice weak, but his eyes still held the sharpness of someone who had lived through battles. He needed help, more than the hospital was giving him. The system was slow, paperwork piled up, and the man was suffering. The nurse couldn't stand it. Rules were rules, but sometimes, humanity had to come first. So, the nurse did something risky. They bent the rules, just a little, to make sure the veteran got the care he deserved. Maybe it was an extra dose of pain medication when no one was looking. Maybe it was pulling strings to get him seen by a specialist faster. Whatever it was, it came from a place of compassion. But in a place like this, where policies were strict and mistakes were punished, even good intentions could cost you everything. It didn't take long for someone to notice. A supervisor, clipboard in hand, coldly pointed out the violation. There were no warnings, no discussions, just a swift decision. The nurse was called into an office, told they had broken protocol, and handed a termination letter. Just like that, years of service meant nothing. The nurse walked out of the hospital that day feeling numb, wondering how doing the right thing could feel so wrong. But life has a way of balancing the scales when you least expect it. 3 days later, the hospital was running like usual, patients coming and going, staff doing their jobs. Then, without warning, the front doors swung open. A group of men in uniform walked in, their presence commanding immediate attention. At the center was a high-ranking general, a man whose very name carried weight. The staff froze. Whispers spread. Why was he here? The general didn't pause for greetings. He walked straight to the front desk, his voice firm but calm. "I'm looking for the nurse who took care of my father." Silence. The supervisor who had fired the nurse stepped forward, nervous but trying to keep professional. "Your father, sir." The general's eyes hardened. "The veteran in room 214. He passed away last night. Before he did, he told me about the nurse who went out of their way to help him when no one else would." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'd like to thank them personally." The supervisor's face paled. No one spoke. The air in the room grew heavy. Somewhere outside those hospital walls, the fired nurse had no idea their life was about to change forever. The hospital lobby was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The general's words hung in the air like a storm about to break. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably, gripping the clipboard a little too tight. Sweat beaded on their forehead. "Sir," the supervisor began, voice unsteady, "the nurse you're referring to is no longer with us." The general's expression darkened. His sharp eyes locked onto the supervisor's face, reading every flicker of hesitation. "No longer with you," he repeated, his tone dangerously calm. "Explain." The supervisor swallowed hard. There was a policy violation. The nurse acted outside of hospital protocol. We had to let them go. A muscle in the general's jaw twitched. He took a slow breath, the kind a man takes before making a decision that could change everything. "Let me understand this," he said, his voice low but carrying across the room. "My father, a man who fought for this country, who spent his last days in pain, was shown kindness by one of your staff. And instead of thanking them, you fired them?" No one dared to speak. The other staff members looked down, avoiding eye contact. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. The general turned to the other officers with him, nodding once. One of them stepped forward, pulling out a phone. "We'll need the nurse's contact information," the officer said. "Immediately." The supervisor hesitated, but one look from the general wiped away any resistance. They hurried to the records, hands shaking as they scribbled down the information. Meanwhile, the fired nurse had no idea any of this was happening. At home, sitting at a small kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold, the nurse stared at the termination letter. Bills were piling up. Job applications had been sent out, but no calls yet. The worst part wasn't the lost paycheck, it was the guilt. Had they really done the wrong thing? Should they have just followed the rules and let the old man suffer? A hard knock at the door shattered the silence. The nurse frowned. No one ever came by unannounced. Walking to the door, they peered through the peephole, and froze. Military uniforms. Heart pounding, the nurse opened the door. Standing there was the high-ranking general himself, his posture rigid, his gaze intense. For a long second, neither spoke. Then, the general broke the silence. "I think we need to talk." The nurse stood frozen in the doorway, fingers gripping the edge of the door. The general's presence filled the small space, his posture straight, his eyes sharp, the kind of man who carried authority without needing to raise his voice. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then the nurse stepped aside, motioning weakly. "Come in." The general walked in, glancing around the modest apartment. His gaze lingered on the kitchen table, the termination letter still lying there, the cold coffee beside it. He didn't sit. Instead, he turned to face the nurse directly. "My father told me about you," he said. His voice was quieter now, but the weight of his words was heavy. "He said you were the only one who treated him like a human being in that place." The nurse swallowed hard, unsure where this was going. I just did what anyone would have done." The general shook his head. "No. You did what should have been done. And they fired you for it." There was no anger in his tone, just something harder. Disappointment. The nurse looked down, shame and frustration twisting inside them. "I broke protocol. I knew the risks." The general studied them for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded photograph. He handed it over. The nurse opened it carefully. It was an old picture, a young soldier in uniform, grinning beside his army buddies. The face was unmistakable. The veteran from room 214, decades younger, full of life. "That was my father before war aged him," the general said quietly. "Before the system forgot about him. You saw him when no one else did." He paused. "And I don't forget people who look after my own." The nurse's throat tightened. They didn't know what to say. The general took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "I have a proposition for you." Outside, a car door slammed. Through the window, the nurse could see two more uniformed officers waiting by a black SUV. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a thank you visit. The general met their eyes. "How would you like to come back to that hospital, but this time, with me by your side?" The nurse's hands trembled slightly as they stared at the general. His offer hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility, but still unclear. "Come back to the hospital, with you," the nurse repeated slowly. "I don't understand." The general's expression didn't change. "You will." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Be ready in 1 hour. Wear something professional." And just like that, he was gone, leaving the nurse standing there, heart pounding, the old photograph still clutched in their hand. An hour. That was all the time they had to process everything. The nurse rushed, showered, changed, tried to smooth down hair still damp with nerves. What was happening? Was this some kind of job offer? A chance to confront the hospital? Or something else entirely? Right on time, a sharp knock came at the door. This time, it was one of the officers from earlier. "Ma'am/sir," he said respectfully, "the general is waiting in the car." The ride to the hospital was silent. The nurse stared out the window, watching the city blur past. The general sat stiffly in the front seat, never turning around, never speaking. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. When the SUV pulled up to the hospital entrance, the nurse's stomach dropped. This was the last place they wanted to be. But before they could hesitate, the general was already stepping out, his uniform crisp, his posture commanding attention. "Stay close," was all he said. The moment they walked through the doors, heads turned. Staff froze mid-step. Whispers erupted like wildfire. The nurse kept their eyes forward, but they could feel the stares, confusion, shock, even fear. The general didn't stop at the front desk. He didn't stop for anyone. He walked straight toward the administration offices, his boots echoing on the tile floor like a drumbeat. Then, the door to the hospital director's office swung open. Inside, the director, a stern-faced man in a tailored suit, looked up from his paperwork. His eyes widened when he saw the general. He stood quickly, smoothing his tie. "General. This is unexpected. What can I do for you?" The general didn't smile. "You can start by explaining why this nurse was fired for showing basic human decency to a dying veteran." The director's face went pale. His gaze flicked to the nurse, then back to the general. I assure you, there must be some misunderstanding. Our policies are in place for a reason." "Your policies," the general interrupted, his voice like steel, nearly broke a good man. "And you punished the one person who tried to help him." He leaned forward slightly. "So here's what's going to happen next." The nurse held their breath. The general pulled a folded document from his inside pocket and placed it on the desk with deliberate slowness. The director reached for it, hands shaking. As he read, his face drained of color. Whatever was in that document, it changed everything. The hospital director's hands trembled as he scanned the document. His lips moved silently, eyes darting back and forth across the page like a man reading his own verdict. When he finally looked up, his expression was that of someone who'd just been handed a live grenade. This can't be right," he stammered, voice cracking. The general didn't blink. "It's been signed by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. I suggest you read it again." A heavy silence filled the room. The nurse stood frozen, watching the power dynamics shift in real time. Just days ago, they'd been powerless. Now they were witnessing the hospital's most powerful man crumbling under the weight of a single piece of paper. The director swallowed hard. "General, surely we can discuss this." "No discussion." The general cut him off. "Effective immediately, this hospital's VA funding and accreditation are under review. Every case involving veteran care for the past 3 years will be audited." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And you will reinstate this nurse with full back pay and a formal apology." The nurse's breath caught in their throat. This wasn't just about them anymore, this was about every veteran who'd ever been treated as just another number in the system. The director opened his mouth, then closed it again. His shoulders slumped in defeat. "Of course. Whatever you require." The general turned to the nurse for the first time since entering the office. "There's one more condition." His steely expression softened slightly. "You'll be appointed as the new VA patient advocate for this facility. Directly answerable to my office." The room seemed to spin. The nurse gripped the back of a chair for support. "Me? But I'm just..." "You're exactly what these veterans need," the general said firmly. "Someone who sees them as people first." As they left the office, the hospital staff stared openly. Whispers followed them down the hall. The nurse could barely process what had just happened. In the span of 15 minutes, they'd gone from unemployed to having more power to create change than they'd ever dreamed. Outside in the parking lot, the general finally broke his military bearing with a tired sigh. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. That document forces them to clean house, but the real work starts now. He fixed the nurse with a piercing look. Are you ready for what comes next? Before the nurse could answer, a commotion erupted at the hospital entrance. A young man in scrubs came running toward them, face flushed. Code Blue in Ward 4. It's another veteran, they're saying he's crashing. The general's face darkened. Show me. As they raced back inside, the nurse realized with sudden clarity, this wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about being there when it mattered most, again and again. The nurse sprinted after the general, their dress shoes slapping against the hospital linoleum. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled their nose as they dodged gurneys and startled staff members. Somewhere ahead, a monotone voice paged, Code Blue, Ward 4. Code Blue, Ward 4. They rounded the corner to find chaos. A crowd of medical personnel swarmed around a hospital bed where an elderly man lay motionless, his face ashen. Machines screamed in alarm, the flatline whine of a heart monitor cutting through the noise. A doctor barked orders as nurses scrambled with crash cart equipment. The general stopped at the doorway, his face hardening as he took in the scene. The nurse didn't hesitate, muscle memory took over as they pushed forward. Let me through, I'm the new VA advocate. The words felt foreign but right. Staff parted instinctively. Up close, the situation looked worse. The patient, another veteran according to his wristband, had gone into full cardiac arrest. A young resident fumbled with the defibrillator pads, hands shaking. The nurse grabbed the paddles. I've got this. Their voice didn't waver. Years of emergency room experience flooded back. Charging to 200, clear. The body jerked as electricity coursed through it. The monitor continued its relentless flat tone. Again. Charging to 300, clear. A second jolt. Then. Beep, beep, beep. The steady rhythm of a heartbeat filled the room. A collective exhale followed. The nurse stepped back, suddenly aware of everyone staring, including the general, whose expression had shifted from granite to something almost like pride. The head doctor wiped his brow. Good save. But this shouldn't have happened, his chart shows he was stable this morning. The nurse picked up the medical file, scanning it quickly. Their stomach dropped. He was supposed to receive cardiac meds 4 hours ago. It's marked here as administered, but, they sniffed the 4-port, then immediately recoiled. There's no residue. This was never given. A hush fell over the room. The implications were clear, someone had falsified records. Again. The general moved like a thundercloud. Who was responsible for this patient's care today? A nurse in the back shuffled nervously. I was covering multiple patients. The staffing sheets show. That's enough. The general's voice could have frozen hell. He turned to the head doctor. You will pull every record for every veteran in this facility tonight. My office will be sending auditors first thing tomorrow. His gaze swept the room. And someone find me the hospital administrator. Now. As staff scattered, the nurse stayed by the veteran's bedside, adjusting his oxygen mask. His papery hand suddenly gripped theirs with surprising strength. Thank you, he wheezed, eyes glassy but aware. The nurse squeezed back gently. Just rest now, sir. We're going to make sure you get proper care from here on out. Across the room, the general was on his phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. When he hung up, he met the nurse's eyes and gave a single nod, a silent promise that this fight was far from over. Because tonight they'd saved one man. But tomorrow? Tomorrow they'd change the whole damn system. The hospital administrator arrived within minutes, his dress shirt wrinkled and his face flushed, clearly roused from sleep. He took one look at the general's stormy expression and the still unstable veteran on the bed, and his shoulders sagged like a man who already knew the battle was lost. What's the situation? he asked, though his tone suggested he dreaded the answer. The general didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word was a hammer strike. Negligence. Fraud. Endangering the lives of men and women who served this country. He held up the veteran's falsified medical chart. This isn't an oversight. This is a pattern. The administrator opened his mouth to protest, but the nurse stepped forward, holding out a second file they'd pulled from the records desk. It's not just him. There are 3 other veterans on this floor alone with missing or delayed medications. One was supposed to have a surgical consult 2 days ago. It was logged as completed, but the patient says no one ever saw him. The administrator's face went slack. For a long moment, he just stared at the documents as if hoping they might rearrange themselves into a different story. Then, quietly, he said, "I had no idea it was this bad." "That's the problem," the general said coldly. "You were supposed to know." A tense silence followed. The nurse watched the administrator's expression shift from shock to resignation. Finally, he straightened his collar and took a deep breath. "What do you need from me?" The general didn't hesitate. "Full access. Every record. Every staff schedule. And a list of everyone who's had oversight on veteran care for the past year." The administrator nodded, already reaching for his phone. "I'll have IT pull everything tonight." As he walked away, the nurse turned to the general. "You think this goes higher up?" The general's jaw tightened. "I know it does. But we're not just going to expose it." He lowered his voice. "We're going to gut the whole rotten system." Dawn broke with a sense of impending storm. By morning, the hospital was buzzing, not with the usual routines, but with hushed conversations and nervous glances. Word had spread. The VA auditors had arrived before sunrise, flanked by uniformed officers, their presence turning the administration wing into a war room. Files were stacked high on every desk. Lawyers whispered in corners. The nurse, now wearing a temporary badge that read VA Patient Advocate, moved through the chaos with purpose. They cross-referenced charts, flagged discrepancies, and, most importantly, visited every veteran on the floor, ensuring they were finally receiving proper care. One patient, a grizzled man in his 70s with a prosthetic leg, watched them work with sharp eyes. "Heard what you did last night," he grunted as the nurse checked his 4. "About damn time someone made those pencil pushers sweat." The nurse smiled faintly. "We're just getting started." Across the room, the general was deep in conversation with a suit-clad official from the VA. Their discussion looked intense, but as the nurse approached, the general turned and gave a small, satisfied nod. "It's done," he said simply. "As of today, this hospital is under federal review. The head of their veteran care program has been suspended pending investigation." He glanced at the nurse. "And you're being officially instated as the new liaison between the VA and this facility." The nurse blinked. "That's a lot." The general almost smiled. "You earned it." But as the nurse looked around at the still tense staff, the wary patients, the mountain of unfinished work, one thought burned brighter than all the rest. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of paperwork, interviews, and hushed conversations behind closed doors. The hospital staff moved through the halls like ghosts, careful not to draw attention. The administration had gone into damage control, apologies were issued, resignations, for personal reasons, were quietly accepted, and suddenly, veteran care became the facility's top priority. The nurse spent their first official day as VA liaison tearing through backlogged cases. They sat with veterans who'd been ignored for months, listening to complaints that had fallen on deaf ears. Each story was another log on the fire fueling their determination. On the third morning, the general arrived unannounced at the nurse's new office, a small but private space that had previously belonged to the now suspended head of patient care. He carried 2 steaming cups of coffee and a folded newspaper. "You made the front page," he said, sliding the paper across the desk. The headline read, "Military Crackdown at Local Hospital. Systemic Neglect of Veterans Exposed." Below it was a photo of the general standing stern-faced beside the hospital director, with the nurse visible in the background reviewing files. The nurse stared at it. "This is bigger than I thought." The general took a seat. "It always was." He sipped his coffee. "But the real work starts now. The cameras will leave. The news cycle will move on. You're the one who has to make sure these changes stick." 1 month later. The difference in the hospital was palpable. New nurses had been hired specifically for the veteran care wing. Medication protocols were strictly enforced with digital tracking. Most importantly, every veteran now had the nurse's direct extension, and they weren't afraid to use it. The nurse was in the middle of reviewing a patient's discharge plan when an aide rushed in. "You need to see this." In the lobby stood a line of a dozen elderly men in faded military hats, some leaning on canes, others in wheelchairs. At the front was the grizzled patient from Ward 4, holding a simple wooden plaque. "Figured you ought to have this," he said gruffly, handing it over. The plaque read, "To the nurse who fought for us when no one else would." Below it were signatures, dozens of them, from every veteran patient who'd been treated since the changes began. The nurse ran fingers over the engraved words, throat suddenly tight. "I was just doing my job." The old man barked a laugh. "Hell, that's what makes it special." Epilogue, 6 months later. The general returned on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. He found the nurse in their office, now decorated with thank you cards and that same wooden plaque prominently displayed. "No fanfare this time," the nurse joked, standing to shake his hand. "Wouldn't want to disrupt your operation." The general's sharp eyes took in the orderly files, the updated patient boards, the fresh coffee pot kept going for visiting family members. "You've done good work here." The nurse shook their head. "We've still got a long way to go." "That's how you know you're doing it right." The general reached into his jacket and produced a single envelope. "Which is why I'm recommending you for a position at the VA Central Office. Bigger platform. More resources. More veterans who need someone like you." The nurse stared at the offer. It was everything they could have wanted, and terrifying in its scope. The general seemed to understand. "You don't have to answer now. But remember, you weren't just fighting for these men." He tapped the plaque on the wall. "You were fighting for what's right." As he left, the nurse looked around at the office, the hospital, the lives they'd changed. Then they picked up the phone and dialed the first number on their now lengthy list of veteran contacts. Because the fight wasn't over. But now? Now they knew how to win.